In the late 1960s, fear had a name in Northern California: the Zodiac Killer. He wasn't just a murderer, he was a mystery, a ghost who taunted the world with letters, ciphers, and phone calls, always staying one step ahead. It began in December 1968 when a young couple was found shot near Vallejo. Months later, another couple was attacked, but this time, the killer called the police himself, calmly confessing to the crime. Then came the letters, strange, coded messages sent to newspapers filled with twisted boasts and threats. "I like killing people because it is so much fun," he wrote in one. The Zodiac didn't have a pattern like most serial killers. He used different weapons, attacked in different locations, and sometimes let victims live. One survivor described his eerie costume: a black hood with a white crosshair symbol on the chest. The image would become infamous. Despite his arrogance, the police never caught him. His ciphers stumped experts for decades. Witness descriptions were vague. Fingerprints, nothing conclusive. Then, the killings stopped. The letters became less frequent, and by the mid-1970s, the Zodiac vanished. But he never truly left. Theories exploded. Was he a former military man, a school teacher, an ordinary citizen who melted back into society? Even today, the case remains unsolved. Theories surface, names are suggested, but no definitive proof has ever emerged. In the autumn of 1888, the streets of London's Whitechapel district were gripped by terror. Women were being murdered in the dead of night, their bodies left in a state so gruesome that even hardened police officers recoiled. The killer? No one knew his name, but the world would come to know him as Jack the Ripper. His reign began in August. Marianne Nichols, a woman struggling to survive in the harsh streets, was found with her throat slit and her body mutilated. Then came Annie Chapman, Catherine Eddowes, Elizabeth Stride. Each victim met a brutal fate, killed with eerie precision as if the murderer had medical knowledge. Panic spread. The police, overwhelmed and unequipped for such horror, found no clear suspects. Then the letters began. One, signed Jack the Ripper, mocked the authorities and threatened more bloodshed. Another arrived with half a human kidney, supposedly from one of his victims. Was it a cruel hoax, or was the killer toying with them? Despite intense investigations, Jack the Ripper was never caught. He vanished as suddenly as he appeared. No arrests, no closure. Just theories, rumors, and fear that lingered long after the killing stopped. More than a century later, the mystery endures. Was he a surgeon? A butcher? Historians, detectives, and amateur sleuths still chase his shadow, hoping to unmask the man who turned London's back streets into a hunting ground. Between 1996 and 1997, the city of Mons, Belgium, became the hunting ground of a faceless killer. He didn't just murder, he dismembered, leaving neatly packaged body parts in garbage bags, discarded near roadsides and waterways. The media called him the Butcher of Mons. It started with a discovery: human remains stuffed into plastic bags, eerily placed in locations where they would be found. At first, police hoped for an isolated crime, but then more bags appeared. More victims, all women. The bodies were cut with precision, suggesting the killer had surgical or anatomical knowledge. Yet there were no witnesses. No clear connections between the victims, no clues pointing to a suspect. The fear in Mons grew. Women were warned to be cautious, but against whom? There was no shadowy figure lurking in alleys, no reports of missing persons before the gruesome discoveries, just body parts methodically placed as if the killer wanted to remind everyone he was still out there. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The last remains were found in 1997. No more victims, no more clues. The police investigated suspects, from doctors to ex-convicts, but nothing stuck. The case went cold. Even now, the identity of the Butcher of Mons remains a mystery. Was he caught for another crime? Did he flee? Or did he simply choose to stop? His name may never be known. For years, the shores of Long Island held a dark secret. Hidden beneath the brush, just beyond the reach of the waves, lay the remains of multiple victims. Women, mostly sex workers, whose disappearances had gone unnoticed. It wasn't until 2010, during a search for a missing woman named Shannon Gilbert, that authorities stumbled upon something far worse: the work of a serial killer. One body turned into two, then four. By the time investigators finished combing the area, at least 10 victims had been uncovered, all dumped along Ocean Parkway. Some had been there for years. Some were wrapped in burlap, others were missing pieces, their remains scattered. But one thing was clear: this was no accident. Someone had been using the beaches of Long Island as a dumping ground. The media dubbed him the Long Island serial killer. Theories swirled. Was he a cop? A hunter? Someone with enough knowledge to evade detection for over a decade? The victims had eerie similarities. Petite escorts lured through online ads, suggesting a predator who knew exactly what he was doing. Years passed and leads dried up. Then in 2023, a shocking breakthrough. Police arrested Rex Huerman, an architect from matching him with several of the murders. But was he LISK or just one of many responsible? Even now, the full truth remains buried. Were all the bodies his victims? Or does another killer still lurk in the shadows of Long Island, waiting for the right moment to strike again? There's a stretch of road in Canada that carries more than just travelers. It carries ghosts. Highway 16, running through the wilderness of British Columbia, is known by a chilling name, the Highway of Tears. For decades, women, many of them Indigenous, have disappeared or been found murdered along this lonely road, their cases unsolved, their families left without answers. The numbers are uncertain. Officially, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, link at least 18 cases between 1969 and 2006. But Indigenous communities say the real number is much higher, possibly over 40. The victims share eerie similarities. Young women, often hitchhiking due to lack of public transportation, vanishing without a trace. Some were later found murdered. Others were never seen again. For years, the question remained. A few cases were solved. Convicted murderer Bobby Jack Fowler was linked to at least one victim through DNA, but the vast majority remain mysteries. The road itself is long, remote, and surrounded by dense forests, making it the perfect hunting ground for a predator or predators who know how to disappear. Families continue to fight for justice, demanding better investigations and more resources to protect vulnerable women. Awareness campaigns and billboards now line the highway, warning against hitchhiking, urging caution. Between 1986 and 1989, a quiet, scenic road in Virginia became the backdrop for a terrifying mystery. The Colonial Parkway, known for its winding paths and historical beauty, was hiding something far darker. A serial killer who preyed on young couples, leaving their bodies in remote areas as if staging a grim tableau. The first victims were Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski, found strangled in Kathy's car near the York River. The vehicle had been pushed down an embankment, an attempt perhaps to erase the crime, but the killer didn't stop. David Knobling and Robin Edwards, a young couple, were shot and left near the James River. Then came Cassandra Haley and Richard Call, who vanished without a trace, their car found abandoned. Finally, Anna Maria Phelps and Daniel Lower were discovered in a wooded area, wrapped in a blanket, their cause of death unclear. 4 crimes, 8 victims. No clear connection, except for one thing. All were young couples, attacked in secluded areas, their cars left behind. Some were strangled, others shot, but the eerie similarities suggested a single predator, someone who understood how to strike in the dark and disappear without leaving much behind. For years, theories swirled. The FBI investigated, but leads went cold. Despite new forensic advancements, the Colonial Parkway Killer remains a ghost, his identity unknown. Even now, couples driving along the parkway may feel an uneasy presence, a lingering shadow from the past, because somewhere the killer may still be out there, watching, waiting, and knowing he was never caught. In 2009, a woman walking her dog on the outskirts of Albuquerque, New Mexico, stumbled upon something horrific, a human bone protruding from the dry, cracked earth. When police arrived, they uncovered a nightmare buried beneath the sand, the remains of 11 women and an unborn child, carefully hidden in what would become known as the West Mesa murder site. The victims, mostly young women involved in sex work or struggling with addiction, had vanished between 2001 and 2005. For years, their disappearances were dismissed until the desert finally gave up its secrets. Someone had been hunting these women, killing them, and methodically disposing of their bodies in this remote wasteland. But who? Investigators had theories. One name stood out: Lorenzo Montoya, a violent man known for luring sex workers to his home. But before police could question him, he was shot and killed by a woman's boyfriend during an attempted attack. His death in 2006 raised more questions than answers. Was he the killer, or just another predator in a city where women were vanishing? Despite years of searching, the West Mesa Bone Collector remains unidentified. The crime scene had been exposed to the elements for too long, erasing crucial evidence. But one thing is certain: someone out there knows the truth. Even today, families of the victims wait for justice. And somewhere, the killer or killers may still be watching, knowing that the desert kept their secret for years. Since the early 2000s, women in Chicago, mostly black, mostly sex workers, have been disappearing, only to be found strangled and discarded in abandoned buildings, alleyways, and vacant lots. Their deaths, eerily similar, should have set off alarms, but for years, no one connected the dots. The numbers are staggering, at least 50 unsolved murders since 2001, all fitting a pattern: women strangled, their bodies dumped in hidden or neglected areas. The victims were often part of vulnerable communities, their cases receiving little media attention. It wasn't until 2018, when the Murder Accountability Project analyzed the data, that a horrifying realization emerged. This wasn't random. Chicago had a serial killer. Or maybe more than one. Theories swirled. Was it a single predator hunting unnoticed for 2 decades? Or multiple killers taking advantage of a system that overlooked these women? Some suspected a trucker, someone who moved in and out of the city undetected. Others believed it could be a local, someone who knew the backstreets, the places where no one looked. Despite modern forensics, surveillance cameras, and DNA technology, no arrests have been made. The cases remain open. Somewhere in Chicago, a predator may still be out there, walking the same streets, passing unnoticed in the crowd. In the spring of 1992, a quiet terror stalked the Midwest. A man with a gun, calm and deliberate, walked into small stores along Interstate 70, murdering 6 people in cold blood. The victims, mostly young women working alone, never had a chance. The killer struck fast, left no apparent motive, and vanished before anyone could react. The first murder happened in Indianapolis on April 8th. A 26-year-old store clerk, Robin Fuldauer, was found shot execution style. Days later, 2 more women were killed in Wichita, Kansas, then another attack in Terre Haute, Indiana, then St. Charles, Missouri, then Raytown. 6 dead, all shot with the same .22 caliber weapon, all in shops near the highway. Witnesses described him as thin, with red or light brown hair, a man who seemed ordinary until he pulled the trigger. Then he disappeared. No security cameras, no fingerprints, no connections between the victims. Just a shadow moving from state to state, killing without hesitation. Police chased leads, but the killer left no trail. A suspect sketch emerged, but no arrests were ever made. Decades later, cold case detectives are still searching. The I-70 killer may have stopped, or he may have moved on, changing his hunting grounds, his methods, but one thing is certain: he was never caught. Before Jack the Ripper terrified London, another shadowy killer stalked the streets of Austin, Texas. The year was 1884, and as the city slept, someone was creeping through the night. A phantom with an axe, targeting women in their own homes. By the time the killing stopped in 1885, at least 8 people were dead, and the killer had vanished, leaving behind one of America's first unsolved serial murder cases. They called him the Servant Girl Annihilator, a name as brutal as his crimes. His victims were mostly black servant women, attacked while they slept, dragged from their beds, and butchered with an axe or a knife. Some were left in the yards outside, as if displayed. A few male victims were killed as well, possibly for being in the way. And then came the final murders: 2 wealthy white women slaughtered on the same night, shocking the entire city. Austin was in a panic. People locked their doors, armed themselves, and refused to walk alone at night. Theories spread. Was the killer a madman? A butcher? Someone with surgical knowledge? Some even whispered that he had fled to England, becoming Jack the Ripper 3 years later. Despite multiple arrests, no one was ever convicted. The killings stopped as suddenly as they began, leaving behind only fear and speculation. Over a century later, the mystery remains. The Servant Girl Annihilator is just a name, a legend of horror that still lingers in the dark corners of Austin's history.